Something is quietly changing between men and women. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, almost invisibly. Relationships are forming less often. More people are remaining single for longer. And even when men and women meet, something about the interaction feels different, more cautious, more uncertain, more distant. At first, it's easy to blame dating apps or changing expectations. But what if the real change is deeper than that? What if the relationship between men and women itself is quietly transforming? Because when you listen closely to the experiences people describe today, a strange pattern begins to appear. Men say dating feels harder to navigate than it used to. Women say finding a genuine connection feels more complicated than ever. Both sides feel the same thing. Something about the dynamic between them no longer works the way it once did. And the strange part is, no one seems to know exactly when this change began or why. The early observations. If you ask people what changed in modern dating, most answers sound familiar. Some blame dating apps. Others say expectations have become unrealistic. Some believe men have stopped trying. Others think women have simply raised their standards. And on the surface, these explanations seem convincing. After all, technology has transformed how people meet. Social norms have shifted. Career paths have changed. Marriage is no longer treated as an inevitable milestone of adulthood. But if you look closely, something about these explanations feels incomplete. Because even outside of apps, something still feels different. You can hear it in everyday conversations. Friends who say dating feels strangely exhausting. People who meet someone promising, but the connection fades before it fully forms. Conversations that seem slightly guarded, slightly cautious, as if both people are trying to decode a situation that used to feel more natural. Daniel noticed this a few years after his divorce. At 38, he had a stable career, a circle of friends, and a life that was mostly in order. When he first started dating again, he assumed things would feel familiar. After all, people still went to restaurants, still talked about their lives, still laughed at the same kinds of jokes. But something about the interactions felt subtly different. Not hostile, just less certain. Sometimes he felt as if every conversation carried an invisible layer of evaluation beneath it, as if both people were trying to figure out what the other expected, without quite saying it. Laura had a similar experience from the other side. At 34, she had spent most of her 20s building a career and a social life she enjoyed. She wasn't opposed to relationships. In fact, she wanted one. But the process of meeting someone who genuinely fit into her life felt strangely complicated. Not because there were no options, but because turning a promising connection into something stable felt harder than it should. Friends around her described the same thing. Dates that felt pleasant but went nowhere. Interest that appeared briefly and then disappeared. Conversations that seemed promising until they quietly dissolved. For both Daniel and Laura, the experience wasn't dramatic enough to call a crisis, but it was consistent enough to notice a pattern. Something about the dynamic between men and women felt less predictable than it once did. And once you begin to notice that pattern, it raises a deeper question. If both men and women still want connection, why does it increasingly feel so difficult to create? And before we go further, I'm curious about something. Have you personally felt this shift in interactions between men and women? Not necessarily hostility, but a kind of distance that didn't seem to exist before. You can share your experience in the comments. Because the interesting thing about changes like this is that people often notice them long before society fully understands them. When a pattern appears in many individual experiences at the same time, it usually means something deeper is happening beneath the surface. And over the past decade, a quiet pattern has begun to emerge. Fewer relationships are forming. More people are remaining single for longer. And even among those who actively want a partner, the path towards a stable relationship feels less clear than it once did. At first glance, this looks like a simple dating problem. But when you step back, the pattern starts to look larger than that. Because the change is not only happening inside dating apps, it's visible across entire societies. People are marrying later than previous generations. Some are choosing not to marry at all. Others enter relationships, but they dissolve more quickly than expected. And behind these trends is a subtle but powerful shift in how men and women encounter each other in everyday life. A few decades ago, the environments where men and women met were structured in ways that made connection more predictable. People met through shared communities, through neighborhoods, through friends of friends, through workplaces that were smaller and more socially connected, through churches, schools, and local organizations. None of these environments guaranteed love, but they did something important. They created repeated, familiar interaction. Men and women saw each other regularly. They existed inside the same social spaces. And because those spaces were shared, relationships often developed gradually rather than suddenly. Attraction could grow over time. Trust could form through repeated encounters. Social circles provided a kind of quiet context around the relationship. In other words, relationships didn't start in isolation. They grew inside a structure. But over time, many of those structures slowly weakened. Communities became more fragmented. Workplaces became more transient. People moved cities more often. Social circles became more smaller and more individualized. And as those structures faded, something subtle disappeared with them. The natural environments where men and women used to meet. In their place, a new system emerged, a system built largely around digital interaction, dating apps, social media, algorithmic visibility. At first, this seemed like an improvement. Instead of meeting only the few people within your immediate social circle, you could now meet hundreds, thousands even. The possibilities appeared endless. But the environment where those interactions occurred had changed dramatically. Instead of repeated encounters within shared communities, most interactions now began between two strangers with no shared social context. Instead of gradual familiarity, the connection had to form almost instantly. Instead of growing inside a network of mutual relationships, the interaction existed mostly between two individuals evaluating each other. And slowly, without anyone consciously deciding it, the dynamic between men and women began to shift. Interactions became more evaluative, more cautious, more uncertain. Not necessarily because men and women wanted it to be that way, but because the environment around them had changed. Daniel felt this when he returned to dating after years of marriage. Meeting someone through an app felt fundamentally different from meeting someone through a shared social circle. There was no shared context, no mutual friends, no familiar environment. Just two people meeting, often with the quiet understanding that both were evaluating whether the other fit into their lives. Laura noticed something similar. Sometimes she would meet someone interesting. The conversation would go well, but the connection still felt fragile, as if it could disappear at any moment. And often it did. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the interaction existed inside an environment where everything felt slightly provisional, where new options were always one swipe away. Over time, experiences like these accumulate.
and when they do, they slowly reshape how people approach connection itself. Men become more cautious about investing emotionally too quickly. Women become more careful about who they trust with their time and attention. Both sides begin navigating relationships with a quiet awareness that the environment around them has become less predictable. And that awareness changes how every interaction begins. Which leads to a deeper realization. The real change might not be that men and women want different things. It might be that the system surrounding them has changed so dramatically that the old pathways toward connection no longer function the same way. And when that happens, something subtle begins to emerge. A growing distance, not necessarily emotional hostility, but uncertainty. Two groups of people who still want connection, trying to find each other inside a system that no longer naturally brings them together. To understand why this shift feels so confusing, it helps to look at what relationships historically represented in adult life. For most modern history, forming a long-term partnership was not simply one option among many. It was the expected direction of adulthood. Men and women both grew up within a cultural framework that assumed relationships would eventually become central to life. People might date different partners along the way, but the general trajectory was widely understood. Education, work, marriage, family. This structure wasn't perfect, and it didn't guarantee happiness, but it created a shared understanding of where life was moving. Both men and women navigated the same broad expectations. Today, that shared structure has largely dissolved. Education paths are longer. Career trajectories are less predictable. People move cities more frequently, and the timeline of adulthood itself has become far more flexible. Marriage is no longer treated as a universal milestone. Parenthood is increasingly optional, and individual fulfillment is often prioritized over traditional life sequences. None of these changes are inherently negative.
In many ways, they represent expanded freedom. But freedom introduces something else as well: complexity. Because when shared social scripts disappear, individuals must begin writing their own. And when millions of people begin doing that at the same time, something interesting happens. The paths of men and women begin to diverge. Not necessarily in values, but in life structure. Men and women now often move through different social environments, develop different timelines for stability, and form different expectations about what a relationship should look like. At the same time, technology amplifies those differences. Social media exposes people to an endless stream of curated lifestyles. Dating apps create the perception of infinite alternatives. Attention becomes fragmented across dozens of digital channels. All of this changes how people evaluate potential partners. Connection begins to compete with comparison. Presence competes with possibility. And gradually, relationships start to feel less like a natural step in life and more like a complex negotiation between two independent worlds. This is not something most people consciously choose. It's something that emerges from the structure of the environment itself. And once that environment changes, the dynamic between men and women begins changing with it. At this point, a deeper insight begins to emerge. The challenge many people feel in modern relationships may not come from men or women themselves. It may come from the disappearance of the system that once helped them connect. For generations, relationships were supported by invisible social scaffolding. Communities, shared expectations, cultural timelines, mutual social circles. These structures quietly guided people toward each other. They reduced uncertainty. They created natural opportunities for connection. But today, much of that scaffolding is gone. What replaced it is a landscape defined by choice, independence, and digital interaction.
And while this landscape offers enormous freedom, it also removes many of the signals that once made relationships easier to form. Men and women now meet each other in an environment where almost everything must be negotiated from scratch. Intentions, expectations, commitment, future plans, even the meaning of the relationship itself. And when every step requires interpretation and negotiation, interactions naturally become more cautious, more analytical, more uncertain. This doesn't mean people have stopped wanting love or companionship. If anything, the desire for connection remains as strong as ever. But the path toward that connection has become far less obvious, which may explain why so many people feel the same quiet confusion. Not anger, not resentment, just a persistent sense that something about relationships feels harder to navigate than it once did. For many men, this uncertainty gradually turns into withdrawal, not necessarily from relationships entirely, but from the process of pursuing them. When the signals around dating feel unclear, some men begin to step back. They focus more on work, hobbies, friendships, or solitary pursuits. Not because they reject connection, but because the path toward it feels increasingly unpredictable. For many women, the experience can feel different but equally confusing. The abundance of potential connections creates its own form of uncertainty. Finding someone compatible becomes less about meeting people and more about filtering through possibilities. And even when a promising connection appears, sustaining it inside a fast-moving digital environment can feel fragile. Both sides feel the same quiet frustration. Connections that seem possible but rarely stabilize. Moments of genuine interest that fade before they fully develop. Over time, these experiences shape expectations. People become slightly more guarded, slightly more selective, slightly more hesitant to invest emotionally too quickly. Not because they want distance, but because the environment around them encourages caution. And gradually, that caution becomes part of the dynamic itself. When people talk about modern relationships, the conversation often turns toward blame. Some say men have changed, others say women have changed. But there is another way to look at the situation.
What if the deeper change is structural? What if men and women are not moving away from each other intentionally, but are simply navigating a world where the traditional pathways between them no longer exist? In that context, the confusion many people feel begins to make more sense. It's not that connection has lost its value, it's that the environment surrounding connection has transformed, and humans are still adapting to that transformation. Men and women today are building relationships in conditions that did not exist for previous generations. Conditions defined by digital interaction, expanded individual choice, and far fewer shared cultural scripts. It's a new landscape, and like any new landscape, it takes time for people to learn how to navigate it. Which brings us back to the quiet change we started with. Something is shifting between men and women, not necessarily in what they want, but in the environment where they try to find each other. The systems that once guided relationships have faded, and the systems replacing them are still evolving. That leaves millions of people searching for connection in a world where the old maps no longer apply. And perhaps that is why so many people feel the same strange sensation today. Not that love has disappeared, but that the path toward it feels less clear than it once did. The question now is not whether relationships will continue to exist. They will. The real question is how men and women will learn to navigate this new landscape together. And that answer may still be unfolding. If you enjoy exploring the deeper patterns shaping modern relationships, consider subscribing to the channel.
Because sometimes the most important changes in society are the ones happening quietly, right in front of us.